Welcome to the New York City Bar Association podcast. Opinions expressed are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the City Bar.
My name is Tess Cohen. I'm the chair of the Mass Incarceration Task Force, the New York City Bar Association. We're here today to discuss an important piece of legislation, the Treatment Court Expansion Act. When this podcast was first recorded, the act was known as the Treatment Not Jail Act, but it was recently renamed to the Treatment Court Expansion Act. This important act is being advocated for by a coalition still known as Treatment Not Jail. And throughout this podcast, we referred to the act by its former name, the Treatment Not Jails. Now, I'm very honored today to be here with Jeffrey Berman and Mark Graham to talk about the Treatment Court Expansion Act, which the New York City Bar Association has come out in support of. Mark Graham is the founder and executive director of the Redemption Center, which offers transitional supportive housing and services to people who are formerly incarcerated. Jeffrey Berman is a mental health attorney with the Legal Aid Society in Manhattan. He focuses primarily on advocating for treatment-based alternatives to incarceration for Legal Aid Society clients who live with serious mental health diagnoses, substance use disorders, and other disabilities. Jeffrey works closely with all the lawyers in his office to advocate for community treatment and not jail for his client. So they're both excellent people to come here and talk to us about treatment, not jail. Jeffrey, can you just tell us a little bit about this bill and why this legislation is so critical and what problems it seeks to solve for justice-involved New Yorkers?
Sure, Tess. Thanks for having me. The Treatment Not Jail is a criminal justice reform bill that's going to change how New York State deals with people who have mental health issues or substance disorders or other disabilities that have contributed to their justice involvement. It's addressing a major problem. The way that we currently rely on jails and prisons instead of community treatment and programming, that's proven to improve public health and public safety. For years, the state has relied on prosecutor-driven treatment courts that are extremely underutilized, limited in opportunity, or non-existent altogether. As a result, New York's jails and prisons have become the largest providers of mental health services in the state. So Treatment Not Jail is about updating and expanding the way we approach criminal justice, especially when it comes to people who have become entangled in the justice system due to an untreated mental health disorder or another disability.
So is there already an existing framework to build off of for Treatment Not Jail, or is it going to be the first of its kind in the state?
It builds off a law from 2009 called judicial diversion, which was passed under Republican leadership. The goal when judicial diversion was enacted into law about 20 years ago was to reduce harsh sentences for people facing drug charges in New York State and to create opportunities for people charged with a limited number of nonviolent property and drug offenses to receive substance use treatment, resulting in the dismissal or reduction of charges following the completion of programming. But this almost 20-year-old judicial diversion statute, which can be found in Criminal Procedure Law 216, focused only on people with substance dependence issues that contributed to the charges. So here are the real issues. If someone's has been charged with someone has a substance use disorder that contributed to their charges, but they don't have the right charge, then they're out of luck. If someone's main challenge isn't drugs or alcohol, but something like depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, PTSD, schizophrenia, or even autism, brain injuries, they're also out of luck. New York only has a handful of what we call ad hoc mental health courts, but the population is about 20 million people, and about half of the people who end up in the state's jails and prisons, which is currently over 40,000 people, have a mental health diagnosis.
So you mentioned these ad hoc mental health courts. Is that getting the job done that we need it to do? Are they successful in diverting a majority of people who have mental health challenges out of the criminal justice system? Why is more needed to be done beyond the courts that exist today?
So these individuals with untreated mental health conditions that contributed to their justice involvement need to rely on local prosecutors to decide whether to refer them to one of the state's 40 ad hoc mental health courts that scattered across the state. And outside of New York City, which does have a proven track record of success with treatment courts, these other mental health courts in the state are few and far between. And it's literally like winning the lottery for people to be referred into one of these courts. And what that means is that the overwhelming majority of people who are becoming entangled in the system due to drugs or alcohol, or are charged with virtually every charge in the penal law, many of whom could benefit from treatment instead of jail, are just stuck and they're incarcerated. And these people are not being diverted into mental health courts when they could get the treatment they need. It's a huge gap in the system that Treatment Not Jail is trying to address. So that is Treatment Not Jail.
So, Jeffrey, can you tell us how this bill expands on the existing structures that we have in the court system?
So it significantly expands on this 20-year-old drug court statute and these limited number of ad hoc mental health courts by recognizing that we have a mental health crisis in New York State, in New York City, and across the country. Here in New York State, 1 in 5 New Yorkers has a mental health diagnosis, and 1/4 of those people have a substance use disorder. And we know that people with substance use disorders and mental health concerns are overrepresented in New York's jail and prison system because 50% of them have some form of mental health diagnosis or substance use disorder and are not receiving any care or treatment. And we also know that Rikers Island is the biggest mental health provider in the country and houses more people with mental illness than any psychiatric hospital in the country. So the first thing that Treatment Not Jail does is it significantly expands on and modernizes this outdated 2009 drug court statute based on decades of research by removing charge restrictions with the exceptions of certain A-level felonies and other charges.
So, Jeffrey, is every person who says that they have a mental health disorder and that they need treatment, are they going to be automatically accepted into these expanded judicial diversion programs under this legislation?
They won't, because there is a stringent public safety analysis that the judge needs to consider when deciding whether to admit someone or not. But we do know that treatment courts should be targeting people who are at the highest risk and not simply people charged with low-level crimes involving the sale of drugs or damaging or stealing property. So Treatment Not Jail will allow consideration of the majority of charges in New York's penal law. Second, a modernized statute goes beyond the limited issue of substance dependence and expands the people who have been diagnosed with different types of mental health and serious mental health disorders, such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, major depression, and personality disorders, all of which contributed to the criminal allegations. And Treatment Not Jail very humanely extends eligible diagnoses to include neurocognitive and intellectual disabilities such as autism or traumatic brain injury that contributed to the charges. And if you think about it, you don't need to be entrenched in the criminal legal system to struggle with one of these issues. Remember, 1 in 5 New Yorkers, which include family members, our children, our grandchildren, friends, we all struggle with the same issues that our clients do. And if one of our family members or friends was arrested due to an untreated mental health condition, wouldn't we hope and expect that the system would treat them fairly and with dignity? So there's not a difference between the clients we see every day and everybody else, except for the reasons that brought our clients into the criminal legal system. Third, Treatment Not Jail allows what's called a pre-plea model for nonviolent charges and misdemeanors, but it would be in the discretion of the judge for the majority of crimes that are classified as violent.
I think one of the things that's been discussed a lot about this proposal is that currently when people enter treatment, they usually have to plead guilty before they get treatment. But this bill actually, goes about this in a different way and doesn't always require people to plead guilty in order to get treatment. Why is it important that we rethink this idea that people have to plead guilty in order to get treatment? Why is it important that we rethink this idea that people have to plead guilty in order to get treatment?
In virtually every treatment court across the state, people are required to enter a plea of guilty to the charge in order to receive treatment for a behavioral health condition that's gone untreated due to systemic failures, inequities, stigma, and trauma. So removing the guilty plea requirement is going to expedite access to treatment and ensure that people aren't going to languish in jail for months or even years waiting for cases to resolve in order to access necessary health care. offering treatment without an upfront plea also addresses the coercive nature of plea bargaining and acknowledges that poor people, particularly people of color, often plead guilty to crimes simply because they can't afford bail. And the last part of this is that the system operates on this carrot stick model, which means that people plead guilty to charges and have a jail sentence literally hanging over their head, but they don't succeed in the treatment court. And that's just not fair. It's not right. It's not consistent with the science that says recovery is a process. And we need to acknowledge that while mental illness doesn't discriminate, it comes down particularly hard on communities of color, which represents the majority of people that we're representing due to systemic racism, profiling, over-policing, biased prosecutors and judges. And so we need to get away from this idea of if you don't make it on the first try, then you get jail, because that really is what's happening. By not having the requirement of a plea, it takes into account that recovery is a process and it takes time. And it may not be as easy for some people as it is for others. And obviously, we know that for non-citizens, the mere admission to a criminal charge can result in deportation, regardless of whether the case is dismissed. People with open pleas or criminal convictions face barriers with employment, licensing, housing, education. These are the systems that can actually offer stability and support people in order to stay out of the criminal legal system.
Well, thank you for that overview, Jeffrey. We really appreciate it. And I'm wondering, both of you spend a lot of your time advocating for this bill and for these changes and to try and increase the availability of mental health treatment to people who have been charged in the criminal justice system. And I'm curious as to what brought the two of you to this work. And Mark, perhaps you could start us off by letting us know how you came to advocate for the treatment, not jail bill.
Thank you very much. A colleague of mine introduced me to Jeffrey maybe, I want to say 5 to 6 years ago. And during that process, I had also had the opportunity to work on a psych ward, the emergency room, getting people into treatment that needed it, a mobile crisis unit at Brookdale Hospital, in addition to working with my own organization where we provide transitional housing for men being released from prison. And one of the most profound things that I experienced on the ground working with those different institutions and organizations is how, as a society and as a community, we write off Black, brown, white, Asian, you name the ethnic group. No one wants to deal with mental health and substance use. Working with the young adult ACT team, I saw how mothers and families were paralyzed because the mother didn't have the wherewithal to help her child. In the psych ward, I saw people who were formerly incarcerated on the psych ward in the community and like totally lost, which missed for years, undiagnosed. And we did them a disservice because we allowed them to leave without the treatment that they needed in order to become an active participant in the community. So when I met Jeff and was introduced to this bill, it was as if this was a match made, if you will, in heaven, because now with this opportunity, I can talk about what it's like living voiceless, people looking at you like you're not part of the community. What are you doing here? And people just looking at you as a human being, because no matter what the chemical addiction is or the mental health challenges, people are people and they're human beings. And if we reach them as human beings, we can make this space and place a better space and place.
Thank you so much, Mark. That's a really interesting perspective, talking about what you saw in the psych ward and people coming home or getting the services that they need in prison. And Jeffrey, love to hear what your experience was that brought you to this work.
Sure. Over the past 3 decades as a public defender at the Legal Aid Society in Manhattan, I've been so privileged to represent thousands of clients. And the things that I've witnessed during that time have been both deeply inspiring and incredibly frustrating. I've seen lives transformed, but mostly I've seen tragedy after tragedy because the system isn't built to help people improve their health. It's built to be punitive, it's built to be traumatizing and to destroy lives. Second chances are not part of the criminal legal system. It's built to destroy over and over again. My clients aren't just people accused of crimes. They're human beings who face massive amounts of discrimination, stigma, poverty, lack of education, housing instability, and very often a complete absence of the support systems that many of us take for granted. They're victims of over-policing, and we know that the criminal legal system mostly targets people of color and people with mental health issues or other disabilities. So it's heartbreaking to see so many people being locked up with no real solutions offered to help them break the cycle of incarceration. It's a system that's too quick to throw people in the jail cell without considering what might actually help them turn their lives around to stop the revolving door. Have seen that mental health and drug courts and other problem-solving courts are very successful. I have seen people who have been cycling in and out of jails finally given the opportunity, and psychiatric hospitalizations, finally given the opportunity to be connected with resources in the community that they just couldn't get in the past due to not having supports, due to their poverty, due to all kinds of reasons. But the problem is getting someone into a mental health court, it's like winning the lottery. We, as lawyers, experience so many roadblocks, especially from prosecutors who just aren't willing to give our clients a chance to get the treatment and supports they need to address the root causes of their action. And this has been a battle for years. We're seeing a shift, and there is a growing recognition where 1 in 5 people lives with a mental health condition that treatment courts work, and they do stop the cycle. Some of our borough-wide prosecutors now are recognizing that mental health courts are more effective for public safety than incarceration, and more people are being diverted than in the past. But Tess, this is not a reality in the rest of the state. And the data supports this. Recidivism rates drop by 50% for those who go through treatment courts compared to the significant increase of rearrest for people who are sent to jail or prison. But even with these improvements, we're still facing daily challenges. The process to be even considered for mental health court or an alternative to incarceration court is filled with many roadblocks, which is frustrating for our clients, for defense attorneys, and even the advocates in the system who want to see change happen. So that's why passing legislation like Treatment Not Jail is so crucial. It's going to give thousands of New Yorkers, especially people who've been impacted by the system over and over again, to break free from the cycle of incarceration and psychiatric hospitalizations to get the treatment that they need. And we're talking about life-changing opportunities for so many people. And it's about time that we stop treating the symptoms with a jail cell and start addressing the root causes with transformative change and support.
So Jeffrey, you started talking about this in your last answer about how this bill can actually improve public safety, which may not be everyone's first reaction to hearing about a bill like this. And I was wondering, Mark, if you could build on what Jeffrey was telling us about how you think this bill would affect public safety.
Oh, absolutely. This is it's like a no-brainer. After spending 25 years myself, 3 as a juvenile and then 22 as adult in prison, I got the opportunity on my way out, like maybe my last year in prison, to see that we got some serious problems, because 95% of these people don't need prison. They need psychiatric help. Prison is not going to do anything for them. First of all, as Jeff eloquently stated earlier, prison does not lend itself to anything outside of punishment. A person that's living with a mental health challenge and a substance use challenge simultaneously does not compute logically like most of us do. And while in prison, what happens? They're traumatized. Now you take a person that's living with a mental health challenge, a substance use challenge, a deprivation challenge, then being treated like they're less than human after they serve their time, and you send them out into the community. What have you done? What you have done is we have impacted the community twofold now. Why? Number one, we never addressed the issue at hand. Number two, we knew that we didn't address the issue at hand. Number three, we knew we made a mistake when we released the person without addressing the underlying issues. And then when the person is rearrested, we want to say, oh, look, no, that's not on the individual. That's on us as a community. And this bill will allow us the opportunity to say those were well invested dollars. It makes sense. We've saved the community.
Yeah, that's a wonderful insight, Mark, into why this bill can make such a big difference. And I think one of the things to add to that, perhaps, and underline what you've already said, Mark, is to add that especially when we're talking about prisons like Rikers, Jeffrey, I'm sure you've seen it with your clients. I know I've seen it with my clients, that experiences at Rikers Island and in New York State prisons really can exacerbate people's mental illnesses. It's not just not getting treatment, it's being in conditions and traumatic circumstances that often make mental illnesses significantly worse. So we're actually releasing people who are worse off than they were when they started their incarceration. I mean, has that been your experience as well, Jeffrey?
I mean, when we're talking about public safety, and it's on everyone's mind, from politicians, the media, people just want to take the subway at night. It's a big topic. But despite all the fear mongering from the media, we know that incarceration makes our communities less safe. We really want to tackle public safety and not just make it look like we're doing something, then we need to pay attention to the science. Study after study shows that Band-Aid jail sentences and prisons aren't solving anything. They're just destabilizing people's lives. They don't fix mental health. They don't treat substance use disorders because people don't receive those treatment services in jails and prisons. Jails and prisons are just making their conditions worse. People are exposed to drugs. People are exposed to violence. People are exposed to gangs. They're isolated from their communities and their family and their support system, and messes with any treatment that they might have been getting. It's extremely traumatizing. And, a lot of people think that public safety is just as kind of like a law and order issue, but to actually make a difference, we need to look at the mental health crisis in our communities, the public health issue. And that's where the solutions lie. And here's what it is. When people are released from jail or prison, it's not as though life suddenly gets easy. People are re-exposed to drug and alcohol use. That doesn't just stop. People with mental health challenges don't magically become stable. It's harder. And quite frankly, it's a disaster for people coming out of jail.
I want to highlight this point that you just made, Jeffrey. I mean, incarcerating people really is just a Band-Aid, and sometimes it's not even a Band-Aid, and often makes people worse. They're further traumatized. They don't receive help for their mental health challenges, their substance use disorders, their sense of solitary confinement, where things often get worse for them. And then they're released back into the community, and we expect them to somehow sort of magically be stable and sober. So can you talk a little bit more about that particular issue and how this act would assist with that?
You see massive problems with homelessness, unemployment, recidivism, people cycling in and out of psychiatric hospitals, going back to jail. It's a revolving door. And I appreciate the work that our doctors and nurses are doing in hospitals for people with psychiatric conditions who really need it. The problem is that when somebody is admitted psychiatrically into a hospital, they are discharged prematurely because Medicaid won't pay for the services anymore. They're given an appointment. They don't have a home, so they're discharged into the shelter system, and probably not the appropriate shelter system. And what can we expect to happen for somebody who doesn't have supports, who doesn't have money? Naturally, they are not going to simply recover. They're going to end up back in the hospital again, and they're going to end up back in jail again. So you think that going to jail is being released is just a fresh start, but for almost everyone, it's just a bigger struggle. We know that within, I think, 3 years of release, 2 out of 3 people are rearrested. More than half of them end up back in prison. I believe the recidivism rate is upwards of 70% within 5 years of release. So this is where something like treatment, not jail comes in. It's about making sure that people get the help that they need to stay out of the system, to end the revolving door. And speaking of solutions, let's talk about diversion courts and how successful they are. These courts have been shown to reduce recidivism by 50%.
What about the cost of this bill? Will there be cost savings in New York State with the passage of a bill like treatment, not jail?
Did you know it costs $556,000 to incarcerate one person per year at Rikers Island? But for every dollar spent on treatment courts, the state saves more than $2. That's a win for everyone. It is a public safety bill, but it's also a public health bill. And instead of relying on these Band-Aid solutions that are proposed by our elected officials, I think that we need to focus on getting to the root cause of why people become entangled in the criminal legal system, and expand treatment options in our communities, expand supported housing. And if people are so unfortunate to become entangled in the criminal legal system, then to expose them to these supports and this housing so that the revolving door ends.
Thank you for that. I think that's a really helpful way of framing this conversation and a really important nuance to bring into it. Mark, I'm curious, what excites you about this bill? Like, what are you looking forward to if this bill passes?
Well, one of the first things that excites me about this bill is that as a community, we're looking now and we're saying this is an issue that we need to address. When it passes, I would think about the young adults that I work with. When I work with the young adult act team in the Bronx, I would think about them getting an opportunity to live and not go to jail and compound their suffering. So I'm really excited about reshaping the future and creating a safer space for us as a community, and creating a safer space, if you will, for the victims, those who are living with the mental health challenges and those who are living with substance use challenges. They're the victims.
Yeah, I think it's exciting for all of us to imagine that future. Absolutely. And I was wondering, Jeffrey, where do things stand with the bill today? You know, what's the hopes in terms of moving it forward?
We're very hopeful. This has been a really significant year for this legislation. The biggest update is that we recently introduced a significant round of amendments that reflect conversations that we've had over the last year with important stakeholders, like the Office of Court Administration and prosecutors' offices. Chief Justice Wilson is a huge proponent of treatment courts, and he's taken every opportunity that he can to talk about how it is time to expand and modernize treatment courts in New York State. I just watched his State of Judiciary, and I was just moved to see that he had one speaker who was currently serving a sentence and was brought to actually speak in person. That was amazing about this person's experience in being incarcerated and not being given a second chance. Last year, the governor and the legislature provided over $30 million in funding to build out mental health courts. across the state. We're going to obviously need more than that to reach the potential of treatment courts, but this was an important first step. And it really teed up treatment, not jail, getting the legislative authority to actually create these courts. I think that this is a massive movement. I think that mental health is in the news every single day. We need to do our best to block out the fear mongering, because every time there's an incident, there's a gut reaction to create some Band-Aid solution. And I think that there's a real growing awareness that Band-Aids don't work. We need to provide people who have been disenfranchised and discriminated against throughout their lives through different systemic failures the opportunity to build a life or rebuild a life. And again, I like to say, end that revolving door.
Great. Is there before I ask my last question, which is going to be how can our listeners help? But before we get to that question, is there anything else either of you want people who are listening to this to know?
I think one of the things that people need to know is that mental health challenges, substance use challenges, goes way beyond our gender, our ethnicity, our class, our status, and everyone who listens to this podcast is impacted either directly or vicariously by this issue. And we don't need to be embarrassed or ashamed to seek help for our loved ones. And this bill, treatment not jail, makes sense, because if you just get jail and no treatment, then we are perpetuating, as Jeffrey said, this revolving door, because we know what the problem is. So since we know what the problem is, we need to address the problem and quite frankly fix it. And we have the ability and the wherewithal to do that.
Thank you for that, Mark. Jeffrey, is there anything else you wanted to add?
I mean, I think about a lot of my clients who are struggling with a mental health issue. And one thing that I see very frequently is embarrassment, fear, never having had an opportunity to talk about their trauma, to talk about abuse that they experience in their lives. And I think there's so much stigma associated with mental illness. So I think that as a society, I think we're making real strides to try to defeat that stigma, but it does exist. And we have to recognize that the stigma is a cause for people not receiving treatment before they were arrested. And the goal of these courts is to connect our clients with real support systems that are going to understand our clients, that are going to treat them with dignity, treat them humanely, and be an outlet to talk about the people's experiences. And I think that's just really an amazing opportunity for our clients who have never had something like that in their lives.
I completely agree. With someone who also has clients in the criminal justice system who are often struggling with mental illnesses, it's really frustrating to see them at times commit crimes that could easily have been prevented if they'd been given treatment earlier in their lives, whether earlier in a criminal justice center. We all know, ideally, even earlier than their lives in that, but at least that they could get the treatment they needed when they were in the criminal justice system, rather than seeing those illnesses get worse because they're incarcerated and then they commit a crime that, we as a society again blame them for. And it's frankly a heartbreaking process to witness, not just for our clients and for their family members, but also for the communities that are impacted by these choices that we're making as a society. So on that note, I'd love to know that if our listeners wanted to help get this bill passed, is there anything that they can do that would be helpful to you all in your efforts?
Well, first off, you can go to treatmentnotjail.com and sign up to join our coalition. It's a huge coalition. In fact, our campaign includes over 70 organizations, hundreds of people. Our members include law enforcement, victims' rights advocates, social workers, public defenders, health experts, and criminal justice agencies, to name a few. And so many of our valued members, Tess, are people with lived experience, people who have lived through and been traumatized by the horrors of incarceration while suffering through their mental health conditions. So we are a broad coalition that brings many perspectives to the table, and that is what's going to make these courts successful.
And I want to just piggyback off what Jeffrey said, and I can't stress this enough. We are all impacted and affected by this. We also have the systematic authority to change this. And how do we change it? Again, Jeff gave you one path forward in terms of joining our coalition. Another way that you support it is you start talking about this amongst yourselves, amongst your friends, amongst your family. Talk about it. Talk about it. Because that's how we began to let people know who are living with mental health challenges and substance use challenges. We see you and we hear you. And we're going to do something about it. We're going to help you. So we need to revolve around each other as a community. There's this proverb that says that it takes a village to raise a child. But when you have a village that is not healthy and a village that is sick, then the children are going to be sick. And we have the opportunity to help our children navigate this for their children. So get involved. Talk about it. Don't keep it in the closet.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, both of you. This has been a really thoughtful and interesting conversation. And anyone who is interested in learning more about Treatment Not Jail, you can go to the Treatment Not Jail website. You can also see the memos and support that the Bar Association has put out in favor of it. And we hope you enjoyed listening to us.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the New York City Bar Association podcast. Opinions expressed are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the City Bar. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe wherever you listen. Find more City Bar podcasts on Apple, Spotify, YouTube Music, iHeart, or at our website at www.nycbar.org/podcasts. Be sure to check out This Lawyer's Life, a professional development podcast where we talk with lawyers about seizing opportunities, learning lessons the hard way, and about what makes them tick. And don't miss Building Belonging, a podcast that embraces authentic conversations about DEIB solutions by amplifying the most marginalized voices in the legal industry and exploring spaces others dare not. This podcast was produced and edited by Eli Cohen.